Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Hard Histories book talk with Dr. Lawrence Jackson. My name is Mallory Pilat. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of History. My work is in 19th and 20th century US history with a focus on African American women's history. More specifically, I am interested in the role of Francophilia in the formation of Black modernity and the connections between the Black Anglophone and Francophone worlds at the turn of the century. Launched in the fall of 2020, the Hard Histories at Hopkins project examines the role that racism and discrimination have played at Johns Hopkins, blending research, teaching, public engagement, and the creative arts. Hard Histories aims to engage our broadest communities at Johns Hopkins and in Baltimore in a frank and informed exploration of the myths that have become part of our university story, and to offer evidence of how race and racism have shaped Johns Hopkins. In the spring of 2021, we are hosting a series of book discussions that feature scholars on the histories of slavery and racism in Baltimore and Maryland. Today, we are excited to host the fourth such discussion. We invite our panelists now to turn their cameras on. We are honored to have with us for our conversation, Dr. Lawrence Jackson. Dr. Lawrence Jackson is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English and History at Johns Hopkins University. His research focuses broadly on the history and literature of Black people in the United States. His many works include the book, The Indignant Generation, a narrative history of African American writers and critics, as well as a biography of the writer Chester B. Himes. Today's discussion will center around Dr. Jackson's research on Frederick Douglass in Baltimore and issues of race and racism in the city more broadly that Johns Hopkins must face. Dr. Jackson will be in conversation with Hard Histories Project Director, Dr. Martha Jones. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, as well as a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Jones and Dr. Jackson will be in conversation for about 25 minutes, and then we will turn to your questions. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function. Finally, live captioning is available directly through Zoom. For those who prefer to access captions online, we are posting the link in the chat. Thank you both so much for being here. I will turn the conversation over to Dr. Jones now, and I will see you all at the end of the discussion.
Thank you, Mallory.
Thank you so much, Mallory, and welcome everybody. Welcome back. I think Mallory is a little too modest when she introduced herself, so I'll just take a moment to say that lots of you have heard us mention the Hard Histories Lab that we have been working with this past semester. And Mallory has been our wonderful teaching assistant working hands-on with the students in the lab on their explorations of this history. So double thanks, Mallory, for everything you've done this semester for Hard Histories at Hopkins. Dr. Jackson, I want to welcome you, and I want to thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. I don't think we've spoken to anybody who brings more to the table when it comes to Hard Histories than do you. From your own history as a native Baltimorean and your leadership at the Billie Holiday Project for Liberation Arts, we very much think of you as part of our Hard Histories community and are really honored to have you with us today. As Mallory said, we've asked you to come to talk specifically about your research and teaching on early Baltimore, 19th century Baltimore, and in particular, your distinct look at, I guess it's fair to say, still the best remembered Black Baltimorean of the early 19th century, Frederick Douglass, or as you've so rightly referred to him, Frederick Bailey. And our work this semester in the lab has included the reading, close reading of slave narratives from Baltimore and Anne Arundel County, in an effort to better understand the lives of enslaved people, those in Mr. Hopkins's household, but enslaved people in Maryland more generally. So my role today is to pose to you some questions, to invite you to do some show and tell with us, and then to shepherd you through the questions that will come from our audience. So let me remind folks, drop your questions in the Q&A box. They will come to me by the magic of the virtual environment, and we'll be very happy to pose those to Dr. Jackson just a little bit later in the hour. So Dr. Jackson, if I could, a first question before I invite you to do some show and tell. I'm imagining that your first, or one of your first encounters with Frederick Bailey, with Frederick Douglass, was the reading of those 19th century narratives that Douglass publishes. Still, your work has gone so far beyond the text. But I did want to ask you about the narrative. When you first encountered it, and did you see your Baltimore in that story? How did you initially find your way into that narrative as someone who knows the city so well, but from clearly a very different period?
Martha, thank you so very much for having me this afternoon. And it's a great joy to speak with your community. It's also a moment of extraordinary humility for me, a person who is not a professionally trained historian, but who yet is making these, overtures and wandering into the field and the terrain of so many, of the foremost specialists. So it's actually with like a lot of fun and playfulness, really, that I begin the discussion, and also, like I said, with humility. You mentioned, sort of how do we get to Douglass? And of course, Douglass is a central figure here in the city and of course in the state. My mom went to Frederick Douglass Senior High School. Frederick Douglass Senior High is an anchoring point for those of us in West Baltimore. And we have the poets on the east side, but those of us who are proud West Baltimoreans, sort of think of our anchor institution as Frederick Douglass Senior High, the place that created the generations that would really transform not just the city but the United States. And the only way I can answer your question honestly is to say that I returned circuitously to Douglass through Ralph Ellison, reading the drafts of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man at the Library of Congress in the 1990s. I came across the line where, one that was excised that they decided was like too over the top for the published novel. And Ellison has these characters debating the merits of Frederick Douglass. And one character says, man, Frederick Douglass, I think he was an Uncle Tom. He should have carried a machine gun. And, he should, it's a surreal, absurdist kind of a conversation, right? Deliberately anachronistic. But nonetheless, it was sort of like this challenge to Frederick Douglass, the idea and the ideal of Frederick Douglass as, the emancipator, the deliverer. And I was sort of saying, this is pretty fascinating, and wonder what's if there's more to it. As my dear friend Juanima Lubiano, would always say, we never know these books until we have to go into the classroom and present them. And I'm sure that, I had only been in a very cursory way thinking about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass until I was presenting the material at Howard University to, sort of the first year students, a great bunch, really extraordinary group of young people. And it made me think about, sort of what the narrative meant, and also what it had to say about Douglass as a Marylander, and then, surprise, surprise, as a Baltimorean. And, once I sort of, was reading this thing like, wow, this guy is actually living in Baltimore City from 1826 to 1833, and then from 1836 to 1838. And this is the place where he learns to read. And this is like the place where he has, all of these relationships and communities and networks. And this is where he meets the person that he, marries and lives with for many, many decades. And it's sort of, I said, wow, I got to think a little bit more seriously about Baltimore. I don't want to be like these, the people who use it as a launching pad and never look back. And, I started thinking more and more about Douglass in that way as a native. And also, of course, the famous 1864 quote, "My life has been distinguished by two important events dated about 26 years apart. One was my running away from Maryland, and the other is my returning to Maryland tonight." And, I thought, this is just like balderdash, or, this is Douglass, sort of massaging the audience at the Bethel Church in 1864. But I think, lo and behold, there's actually a little bit more to it than that. So I've been having a very joyful and an extraordinary self-learning. I'm an autodidact, of course, but a journey really to think about Douglass seriously as being an intellectual created here in the city and by the city's communities.
Ah, I love that because there is a way in which I think that there's a lot of picking up and putting down, or sort of engaging Douglass as the launching point in the literature. And so I'm going to out you as an actual historian of Douglass's life. I know that you have an essay forthcoming in Michelle Roy's new book, Frederick Douglass in Context. And so that'll be out in May, and we'll keep an eye out for that. But what's most interesting for me, frankly, is that you just haven't been satisfied. You haven't been constrained by the scholarly artifacts like books and articles and texts in this research at all. And you've been really deliberate about turning to digital technologies, to taking seriously the possibilities of the digital humanities, including mapping software, as a way to tell Douglass's story in new ways. But I think also understanding Douglass's stories in new ways by taking seriously the visual, taking seriously the spatial. Would it be all right if I gave you a few minutes to share your screen? And we don't have a lot of time, but at least to give folks a flavor for the kind of work you've been doing. And I know that we'll drop in the chat links to some of the digital projects that folks can tune in and spend a little more time. Terrific, thank you.
Yeah, we'd love to. For me, major part of this journey, and I actually did take a graduate seminar. I took the students who were enrolled in this seminar, I gave them the opportunity to travel by sailboat from the South River in Annapolis to the Wye River in Talbot County, across the Chesapeake Bay, to sort of experience some elements of 19th century travel firsthand. But it was very much the maps from the 19th century that began to transform my spatial logic and understanding of Douglass as a 19th century Baltimorean. And I have relied very heavily on two maps. One of them is this 1851 Sidney and Neff, which is just sort of marvelously detailed as you go in to the different neighborhoods. Douglass was, and actually I will just share, as pardon the audience, please pardon how rapidly we go through. Douglass, I found, was really understood with this historic place in mind. This is the cottage that was used by Aaron Anthony, where Douglass sort of has some of his earliest memories after leaving the Tuckahoe Creek and his grandmother's. And it seemed to me that because of the prominence of the Lloyd family, this is the famous Wye House estate owned by the Lloyds since the, this house was built in the end of the 18th century, but, thousands of acres of Eastern Shore land have been owned by the Lloyd family since really the end of the English Civil War. And it seemed to me that so many people approached Douglass and his life as if he were either always inclined to associate himself almost, basically as blood kin of the Lloyds of the manor, or if in some ways he was seeking some kind of, almost like a Civil War reconciliation, rapprochement, North and South, abolitionists and Confederates or slaveholders, and that using Douglass as a figure, they would be able to, in the way that is done by many major American artists, they would be able to draw the country together and to use Douglass as a symbol for that sort of unification. And to me, to be very frank, right, there were parts of this narrative that I felt like were offensive, and that they were deliberately eliding and silencing Black communities, and especially Black literate communities. I know we don't have much time, but I'll just emphasize a couple of points. One was that it's always, in much of the earlier scholarship, the existence of Black people in Fells Point is always minimized, as if Douglass was the only Black person there. But in reality, in the ward that he lived in, there were many hundreds of Black people. And in fact, on his street, or, sort of in his neighborhood, there were free Black boys his same age. So Douglass had as, sort of a model for this freed person, this elegant freed person, this literate elegant freed person. There were actual tangible examples, of other Black people who were actually doing this. And the red dot is the house where Douglass was most of the time. And this other red dot in the upper part of the screen is the place, the initial home of the Auld family. But, this is the context that Douglass, inhabited as he was becoming literate. And we also think of these moments as being almost fully in the context of the White Auld family and also some religious experiences. But in fact, the largest, for that section of the town, the largest Black church was the Strawberry Alley Meeting House. And it was, basically 4 blocks away on Dallas Street. This is contemporary Dallas Street today. And I think I have a slide that'll give you, I'm sorry, again, I apologize to your audience. They're like, hey, this is making me nauseous, getting vertigo going through these. But I did put one up today so that you could, just sort of see this historic building that's really quite remarkable. This is where I believe Douglass learned to read, or was really exposed to Black literate communities. If you noticed here on the Sidney and Neff map, that's African Methodist Church at Strawberry Alley, just before you get to modern day Eastern Avenue. And it's sort of fascinating. In this church, which was the one of the earliest Methodist structures in Baltimore, this was by the beginning of the 1800s. The Black worshipers there were, the numbers of them were so large that basically the Methodist Church ceded the Strawberry Alley Church to African Americans. And this is the place that Douglass goes in the company with the man he called Father Lawson, the person that he, leaves against the rules, right? He's defying Hugh Auld to go to Father Lawson's and to read surreptitiously. Father Lawson wasn't the world's greatest reader, but he did have his own house with other free Black adults. And, again, the introduction to the community of Black worshipers, Christians, and readers. And it's also in this church that I believe that Douglass had the opportunity, Martha, to hear William Watkins, who was a Sharp Street he was a minister connected to Sharp Street, but a full-time teacher, and he would make the rounds to Baltimore's churches. And we know that Douglass went to Sharp Street because during the cholera epidemic in 1832, this is where everybody has to get their instructions about hygiene from the Black physician, Lewis G. Wells, who died unfortunately shortly thereafter, but was a part of this African-American community of intellectuals that includes many other prominent teachers who were also ministers in Black churches. You have, we talk about Baltimore also as a place that was home to some Black classicists. And you have at the St. James Church, the church that I grew up in, William Levington, who almost certainly was schooled in some Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, the first ordained Episcopalian priest south of the Black priest south of the Mason-Dixon line. I don't want to go on because I know we're running out of time, but you just tell me what I should stop.
No, I mean, that's terrific. And you're speaking right to my heart, because these are the communities that I too have found myself drawn into and immersed in, to think about the political culture that is emerging out of Black Baltimore in these years, and the struggles over the Constitution, over legal rights, and more. So I think that I share your sense of this world that Douglass not only occupies, but he is in so many ways a part of. And that really takes me, I guess, to a next question, and maybe I can ask you to unshare your screen. Yeah, thank you. It takes me to a next question that I think helps us connect this story to the hard histories questions that we've been exploring this semester. And it is this, in some ways, your work paints a picture of a world that is rich, that is dynamic, that is substantive, that is in many ways promising for a man like Douglass. It is a place remarkably full of possibilities, a city that is full of formerly enslaved people, the descendants of slaves, who are building institutions, building families, building communities, building ideas, building politics. So I think the question that folks might be asking themselves is, then why does Douglass steal himself? Why does he leave? Why does he escape? Why does he defy law? Why does he defy those who claim him as property? Why abandon Baltimore if Baltimore is the place that I think it is, as you describe it, such a rich and important place to be, even for a young enslaved man? Why does he leave?
I think that it maybe for Douglass, in some ways, the literal price of freedom might have seemed too high. I think that the context here is really quite crucial. It's also at the moment when the American Colonization Society is really at its peak. And so you have, perhaps, debatably, the foremost intellectual figure from the city, born in Frederick, Maryland, but, makes his career in Baltimore, Daniel Coker, the first author of an abolitionist pamphlet living in below the Mason-Dixon line. And Coker will immigrate to what becomes Liberia. And is going to be one of these figures who, after being the first elected bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, in fact, giving up his role and giving it to Richard Allen, saying, it's better that you lead, but that Coker will think, well, our fortunes are better abroad. That the Bethel minister Nathaniel Peck again, sort of really getting underway in the mid 1830s. And by the end of the decade, we'll be scouting out new land in Guyana and Trinidad. And we'll be saying, you know, our fortunes are, we're going to be able to do better abroad. The intellectual community, that William Watkins himself immigrating to Canada, Francis Ellen Watkins Harper, going to Ohio and then working in the North. The constriction of enslavement and different measures to control the livelihood and the intellectual work of the Black community at that time, will become formidable enough that, there is something of an exodus that either is underway or is planned. Certainly Philadelphia and New York and Boston, Massachusetts will begin to seem like better places for, again, making a reasonable kind of a life. There are some other dynamics in place because Baltimore has such a large number, the largest number of freed people, really up until the Civil War in, sort of one urban space and, below the Mason-Dixon line. But working conditions are always devastatingly difficult. It is very difficult to create the capacity for like a Black, we would say maybe an upper working class, but for our purposes today, perhaps a middle class, one that is not a serving class, a raw laboring class. And in some ways, Douglass is trained as a caulker, which had been, a very traditional, almost lucrative source of employment for Black men. Work on the water and work as a caulker. You have a couple of people who become ship's carpenters and shipbuilders, but they sort of reach their greatest, power with one Black company, in the 1850s and 1860s. But it's a struggle the whole way, and the ethnic and racial divisions of the city are always being used to tear down their power as a group. To advocate for higher wages. Douglass talks about this in the narrative, of course, but it just becomes increasingly difficult in the urban South for Black people to exist as more than just laborers.
We had historian Jenny Williams with us just a couple of weeks ago to talk about the force of colonization, the climate of Baltimore, and also the influence that the domestic slave trade, the pressure that the domestic slave trade is subjecting all Black Baltimoreans to. Of course,
Douglass always fearing that.
Yeah, always that fear, and Williams does an extraordinary job, right? Sort of mapping out how tragically robust that trade was out of the port of Baltimore.
Right.
And so you help us really appreciate that while in many ways there were reasons for Douglass to stay and to try and settle and be part of this place, it turns out, untenable. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn to the questions and answers. Folks are beginning to post their questions, and please continue to do so. And it's sort of a existential one, right? Which is about getting free, right? Because Douglass will leave Baltimore surreptitiously, but of course, it will be many years still before, in a legal formal sense, he is no longer claimed as the property of another. And I wonder how you would answer the question, sort of when is the moment that Douglass himself becomes free, or does he ever become free?
Well, I don't think there's a perfect answer here, but I do think that for Douglass, being able to, for example, buy a house in Anacostia, and then, he's contemplating buying a house. It's not so far from the Howard Beach area today, which was in the 20th century was a black a beach community and resort. As the other beaches were segregated. But Douglass, he sort of had this vision of like returning to the Chesapeake Bay and being able to, sort of consider in his purview, the peninsula of his childhood. He also bought 5 row houses on Strawberry Alley, which, by then, by then it's Dallas Street. Billie Holiday, it's worth noting, also spent a great deal of time on Dallas Street in the 1920s and beyond. But Douglass was, wanting very much to advance the idea of salubrious Black homeownership and Black urban living. And, he was going to, sort of have these houses and, he was going to build up the place of, some of his earliest experiences, religious worship, of course, and also early literacy and Black community. And so I think that for him, in some ways, those were very profound, like freedom gestures. Like this is what a freed person, is absolutely about. And of course, we know that Douglass, always in a difficult political contest, he advocated, casting your buckets down where you are, right? He advocated Black people staying in the South despite the misery of the conditions. And, I think that those property gestures on his behalf, sort of signal that he did seek in some ways a particular kind of a belonging and a return to these places of his nativity.
Yeah, I love that because it's not metaphor. And, I'm someone who's written a lot about folks who are refugees. And this is one way to think about Douglass when he flees Baltimore and Maryland, right? He becomes refugeed in the North. And there are so many Black Southerners who are refugeed, but that persistent, right? That sort of indelible notion, right? For many, just a dream, right? But that notion that you return and you reclaim a place, I think is an experience that helps us appreciate why Douglass's story is so widely read and so universally understood, because I think that he speaks to a kind of longing that many folks who are refugeed experience. Questions are pouring in, so let me try and be attentive because I could talk to you all afternoon. The first question is about Anna Douglass, who isn't mentioned much in the first narrative, but we know that she aids Douglass in his escape from Baltimore. How do you think about, in the text, her erasure, but perhaps more broadly about how we should be situating her in this narrative, but in this history?
I was trying to see if I could come up with my one of my slides towards the conclusion. I'm not getting through fast enough. A couple of things, so Anna Douglass is a fascinating figure for multiple reasons. So on the one hand, this is someone who is also originally from the Eastern Shore, who is who's going to be the child of ultimately freed people who will be migrating from the rural Eastern Shore to Baltimore. And so she's going to be a person who in some ways will grow up with a far more urban experience, perhaps than even Douglass knew, and will be making her way as an independent woman and wage earner. Her daughter, Rosetta Sprague, said that Mom saved her money for 7 years. And this is the bedrock of the literal freedom dream of the couple, Frederick Bailey and Anna Murray, both become, Frederick and Anna Douglass when they go to New York. In other words, this is the money that would be paying for these locomotive tickets and the hacks who would be carrying the baggage, and then the ferries across the different rivers, and enabling us to get from Philadelphia to Newark to Hoboken, and then sort of across the river and that kind of thing. And it is certainly most possible that it would not have, his escape would not have occurred under any other means. I mean, in other words, in the 1845 narrative, Douglass deliberately removes, and it is an abolitionist text in my view. This is also the view of my colleague, Professor Levine at University of Maryland. This is a text that wants to build support in the North for the abolitionist movement, and sort of get the public spirit and furor going. And so he's really, really careful in terms of like building bridges with liberal whites and removing from view anything that might be used by the communities that want to keep slavery going. So, how Blacks help and support one another is going to be, sort of deliberately occluded in this text. So we don't find out much in 1845 about Anna Douglas's role. But this gambit that they both take, that look, we're going to use the railroads to get away instead of an overland coach, which would have subjected them to probably a significantly greater level of scrutiny. The locomotives are almost brand new. It's sort of like this frightening technology. And I think the steam boilers on these locomotives probably blew up, pretty frequently too. So it's like it's a daring form of technology. People would have been anticipating a route by sea or a route by land, and immediately the Alds could have sort of alerted the different slave catchers and slave dealers, and they could have gone right after their person. So it's a combination, I think, of the literally the economic wherewithal that Anna Murray provides, and then also so much of this planning and understanding of these new technologies, which also to me suggests a much larger community and strategies, in the churches, Sharp Street and Strawberry Alley, that would enable that kind of successful escape. Certainly, this woman is the foundation of the economy and the ability to live for the Douglas family once they go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then on to Rochester. They have now, I want to say they have ultimately have five. They either have 6 children or 5 children. One daughter dies when Douglas is overseas. But it's very much Anna Murray Douglas who is maintaining their household, which was it's incredibly difficult to do. It's not like Douglas has a regular job, right? He is soliciting, for the abolitionist movement, trying to sell his text, trying to get his newspaper going. These are all ventures that are, come see, come saw, a little bit here, a little bit there. It is not without the organizational and business-like efforts of this woman to keep alive this family. Douglas certainly wouldn't have been able to have accomplished or had the freedom to accomplish, sort of the things that he was doing outside of the home.
I've got 3 questions, all of which turn on sort of the foundation, Douglas's foundation as an intellectual, and how to see that as having its origins in Baltimore. I'm thinking about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and I think I'd never really thought about Watkins Harper and Douglas as these 2 really formidable thinkers of the antebellum period, both of whom come out of Baltimore and are not only great thinkers, but eloquent speakers. I think folks would like you to drill a little bit more into the intellectual milieu of Black Baltimore in these years. One of the things about our work at Hard Histories and the kind of atomized look at a household like that of Mr. Hopkins, we lose sight very quickly, right, of this extraordinary world in which enslaved people and later free Black people in Mr. Hopkins's world are part of this other world, and it is a world of ideas. Is it church? Is it school? Sort of, how would you sort of help us appreciate the intellectual life of a city like Baltimore in Douglas's time?
I think it's one that does operate with like a high degree of connectivity. And you know, we can often think of these areas and these individual parishes as, you know, sort of like these separate atoms, but I think that they are actually colliding and working in a molecular fashion that, you know, is really quite significant and does produce really like extraordinary moments, like the successful escape of someone like Douglas, who I think would have been held in fairly significant esteem across Baltimore neighborhoods and across Baltimore communities. I didn't get a chance to mention this before, and you know, maybe the audience is aware, but certainly they should know that you know, Martha, your work on William Watkins and the legal redress strategies that are pursued in the 1830s, you know, the concept of birthright citizenship seems to have gotten underway by, you know, a handful of these Baltimore intellectuals, but especially figures like William Watkins. And so everybody, this is in Martha Jones's book, Birthright Citizenship, which is crucial to our understanding of, you know, Black intellectual life in early national period, but especially here in Baltimore, that that they were making this argument that the Constitution, you know, sort of afforded protections that would enable the exercise of citizenship. You know, for me, it just makes natural sense or sort of ordinary sense, because of the significance of the population here, because you have the earliest Black Methodist churches here. These are Methodist churches that are operating with a significant degree of autonomy. Though Sharp Street and certainly Strawberry Alley, they would have been receiving, you know, sort of an itinerant white minister would be making the rounds. But nonetheless, these are spaces that are completely controlled by African Americans. And obviously, the only thing that is going on is not, or excuse me, all of what's taking place is not limited to Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. You know, we get all of these accounts in the newspaper about, you know, sort of Baltimore is nicknamed Mob Town, and the villainy and the, you know, destructiveness of the street corner mobs are phenomena throughout the 19th century. But we also know that these street corner mobs that are doing things like going after the speculators with the bank failure in 1834 and 1835, that they're also really, really politically motivated mobs. And of course, if they're politically motivated, there's always the circulation of materials, the circulation of incendiary pamphlets is the way that they describe it in 1835. Again, this circuit of Black ministers at Sharp Street and at the Bethel Church, at the St. James Church, they are actually in public, you know, sort of saying, look, we understand that there's a liberal consciousness here in Maryland, distinct from Virginia and certainly from South Carolina, that enables us as freed people to, again, successfully lead our own communities and to have a fairly high level dialogue and debate about chattel slavery, especially the righteousness of chattel slavery. And this Baltimore community is producing texts in the fight against this battle. So, you know, I think that you have a couple of, you've got the printers on Holiday Street who are open to, you know, sort of running off copies of these Black pamphlets, either the Black abolitionist texts, or later on in the 1840s, Frances Ellen Watkins' book of poetry, Forest Leaves. I mean, we have the first, you know, she's the Phillis Wheatley of Baltimore, the Phillis Wheatley of the South, maybe is the way that we should understand it, right? We have the first publication of poetry by a Black woman in the urban South, taking place here in the 1840s. And just as an example, the reason why that book winds up being archived, and today is in the Maryland Historical Society, is because they have the copy of the minister of the St. James Church, which again gives us the overlap between Sharp Street and then the St. James Church after Levington, which is down the street from the Bethel Church. And I would like to be a little bit more specific or to respond in more specific ways, but I would just I would keep emphasizing that my own thinking about this is just really made possible by the proximity that we can note when we look very closely at the available maps, and when we begin to understand sort of the significance of what one community across the street from another, what it means. If you have 2,000 people going to the Bethel Church on Sunday, and if you have several hundred attending a school that's offered, sort of on the nights through the week across the street, what that means in terms of people coming into proximity with one another. As Baltimore expanded, or as more freed people came to the city and the opportunities became better known, it seems as if there really are three very active neighborhoods. And I didn't want to forget this. There's one small comment about Douglass and some of his teaching in Fells Point, and again it would have to be 1837 or 1838. And he says, I was involved in, sort of the Mental Improvement Association for young men. And it's all of these guys on Wolf Street, and they're all caulkers. And then he says, well, I would offer people this sort of individual instruction. And we used to do it really out of the way, underneath of overturned boats. Now, everyone knows that Douglass is 6'4", right? Douglass is towering over Abraham Lincoln. Douglass is a very, very, a man of considerable stature for the mid-19th century. So, climbing underneath the boat wasn't going to be so easy, even when he's 17, 18. Why would he need to be shielded in this moment of literacy, right? It's not outlawed, and certainly freed people were very much known to be literate. And again, you have such a nexus for Black Christianity here in Baltimore. And all of these Methodists are going to regular class, right? Where everybody's supposed to be reading the Methodist tracts. You're supposed to be reading the Bible. It's all instruction. You progress with your literacy in these Methodist classes. So, from my vantage, it absolutely must be the incendiary pamphlets that they're trying to, sort of keep out of everyone's grasp, but especially in the mid 1830s. It seems as if, by 1835, 1836, you may have like an even more significant circulation of maybe even the basic idea of David Walker's appeal than, sort of in 1829 and 1830, when Georgia is passing laws to make sure that the pamphlet can't be circulated, sort of in the deeper parts of the South. But here in Baltimore, I think that there's a considerably stronger free play of the most incendiary ideas. And just also to mention, when we talk about the 1845 narrative, I think it's very profitably read as a certain kind of extension, or as being written with a very direct eye to Walker's preamble and first chapter in the appeal.
What you're reminding me of is some of the research that we've been doing this semester around public education in Baltimore in these very years. And the figures that you're talking about are also coming before the city council to petition for to oppose taxation without representation, right? Black Baltimoreans are paying taxes that support public education, and yet their children are not admitted to the schools. And they will return again and again to the council, which is to say that this culture, this intellectual culture and its foundations is not a secret. It's not clandestine at all. It's very much a part of the front-facing politics of Black Baltimoreans. And part of our work this semester is looking at how that story develops immediately following the war, when Baltimore will begin to provide public education for Black children. But now, of course, it is separate, or what we come to call segregated public education. It is never one whole system. So we'll be talking more about that on Friday at another event. But I think it connects really importantly with the picture that you're drawing. I have time for just one more question. And I guess where I want to go here is, if you could just help us appreciate where Douglass goes next and how that's connected to the Baltimore story, which is to say New York, New England, eventually Rochester. You know, there are critics in these years, critics of men like out of Baltimore, critics of men like Douglass and others who leave the city, who leave Maryland, and laud those who stay and sort of fight the good fight in the trenches of Baltimore. Does he really leave Baltimore behind? Or I suspect he doesn't. And how do we know that in those extraordinary years after he is actually free?
Well, that's a very rich question. You know, Douglass, I mentioned the some of the tangible acts, you know, sort of with the at the return, the end of his life, or towards the end of his life. But I also have the sense, at least, that, you know, for Douglass, that the clock was spinning, you know, quite rapidly after leaving Baltimore. That his work and his life were entailed in such a way, as a vigorous member, you know, debatably the most vigorous member of the abolitionist movement, and building the coalitions and doing the work, which of course was international work, in fact, requiring him to, you know, flee for his freedom and his citizenship multiple times. You know, once to outwit the Bloodhounds, and then another time because of the connection to the John Brown raid, and then also really declaring his space, you know, in defiance of William Lloyd Garrison, and also causing him sometimes to fall out with close friends or people who he had been on the abolitionist, Black people that he'd been on the abolitionist circuit with, so that he could, you know, articulate his own vision. I think that that's an incredible process for anyone who is intellectually or inclined to creating literature, which of course is what he was doing, you know, not just in the narratives, but then also in, you know, short fiction like The Heroic Slave. But that, you know, it's this process, and it's one level of its culmination with the events between 1861 and 1865, and then the passage of the historic amendments. That part of his life, you know, I think flowed very swiftly from 1838 through 1865. I would think, you know, based upon my, I guess, my own life course, that, you know, maybe he had the opportunity, and maybe also with the survival by his two sons, you know, they both survived the war. Maybe he was able to slow down somewhat, you know, sort of in the 1870s and 1880s. Of course, Douglass, you know, was in his 60s and 70s by that point, and that, you know, some of the posts that he held with the Freedmen's Bureau, you know, as the minister to Haiti, that these opportunities, you know, sort of gave some chance for a certain kind of reflection. But, you know, he also, as is noted by our colleague, help me, Martha, who teaches at Harvard, John Stauffer. Also, as is noted, Douglass is like incredibly aware of his image and the way that his image circulated nationally. Was like intensely interested in crafting that, I think, for the most fertile of propagandic uses. In other words, sort of understanding the climate of hate and brutality that was created anew after 1865, and then swiftly escalated through the 60s and into the 70s, and reached one apex in 1876, and then would arc to another in his final moments. But that he understood, sort of the value of presenting himself as a kind of a father of the Republic, a Black father of the Republic, one whose sacrifice and standing was, again, very much the equal of Abraham Lincoln and, again, other kinds of national figures from his era, certainly beyond the figures like Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee. I think, we've done our work to establish that. And so in maybe in that way, I think that the ideas about literal return or obligations and debts, perhaps, sort of came about a little bit later. As I've read the 1864 report, I did have a quote that touched on the comment that you just made about education in Baltimore. And what's fascinating is that by the turn of the century, the historical memory, perhaps it was maybe a bit under siege, but it very much was not lost. And some of the most prominent Black Americans who would be involved in the civil rights struggle of the end of the 19th into the 20th century, like Ashby Hawkins, is going to be one of the earliest African-American attorneys. I mean, maybe Hawkins might be the first attorney, I think. And we'll be saying in during the 1830s and 1840s, when the schools were public schools were unavailable to us, and the instructors were William Watkins and Lively and Forty, we produced a generation of teachers that were able to take the Black community forward. And after achieving integration, the successful petitions to the city council and some form of public education, we now have white teachers teaching the students, and he felt like their results were inadequate. So it's an interesting way that the early 20th century considered the legacy of the 19th really in important and extraordinary revisions.
As I said earlier, I could talk to you about this all afternoon, but I have to turn things back to Mallory. But before I do, Dr. Jackson, I want to thank you so much for spending this hour with us. I want to remind folks to visit your extraordinary project, the Mapping Project, Frederick Bailey of Baltimore, to check out your essay in Michelle Roy's forthcoming book, Frederick Douglass in Context. Thank you so very much for spending this time with us. And Mallory, I'm going to turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for this incredibly rich conversation. We're honored to have had you here, and we appreciate how your research sheds light on the questions we are asking at the Hard Histories of Hawkins Project. For me, your work really reminds us that communities, especially intellectual ones, need to be understood as firmly embedded in their environment and within a particular place. And I think there's a tendency in historical narratives to lean toward abstraction. And you really remind us that we need to pay close attention to the material, lived experiences of our subjects and the spatial elements of their stories and communities. So thank you. And thanks to our audience as well for watching and for sending in your great questions. And to the team at the SNF Agora Institute for their support for this event. During these book conversations, we've had the chance to share what we are reading, and we're also interested in what you're reading. What sources have helped you to better understand the hard questions we are asking at the Hard Histories Project? Share them with us and help build our collective Hard Histories bibliography. Let other members of the Hopkins and Baltimore community know about those books and articles that are helping you sort through the history of enslavement and more. You can reach us on social media with the hashtag JHU Hard Histories or at our email address, hardhistories@jhu.edu. We look forward to hearing from you and learning from you too. You can learn more about Hard Histories at Hopkins at hardhistory.jhu.edu. Additional information about our event series, as well as YouTube videos for all of our past events, is posted at snfagora.jhu.edu/events. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.